In 2019, up-and-coming director Sofia Takal was given the task of remaking the 1974 slasher Black Christmas for the second time, after a poorly received first attempt in 2006.
There's someone in the house.
In creating her story, she claimed to want to make the film as feminist as possible. Despite good intentions and a modest box office gross, she ended up receiving a mountain of criticism for what amounted to a 90-minute PSA as opposed to a thought-provoking story.
But to show a sorority filled with real women dealing with current issues that real women face today.
Sofia Takal's attitude, and many others towards horror films of the past, led to me considering one very broad question. Does horror have a women problem? Detractors of the horror genre often point to the worst entries, featuring screaming damsels, gratuitous nudity, and young women being punished for having premarital sex.
Exploring uncharted territory.
Totally charted.
Just talk.
The archetypal slasher movie final girl is normally a chaste virgin who's only able to survive because of her purity.
Leaving the last, to live or die, as fate decides. The virgin.
In classic monster movies, there's often a plot point involving a woman being abducted by whatever and needing to be saved by a strapping alpha male figure. And there's usually screaming. Lots and lots of screaming. The women scream while the men save. So does horror have a women problem? Hell fucking no.
It's a fictional story created to warn young girls of the dangers of having premarital sex.
Horror as a genre is often looked down on by critics and the general public alike.
They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
John Carpenter, responsible for the likes of Halloween and The Fog, which we will get to, has said that horror is often seen as just a step above porn by the majority.
When do we see breasts? I want to see Jamie Lee's breasts. When do we see Jamie Lee's breasts?
Indeed, take a look at works like Silence of the Lambs, Black Swan, Get Out, or The Witch. All part of the horror genre, but often grouped under the label psychological thriller. I've seen more acclaimed works in the genre being described as not a conventional horror, which seems like a backhanded way of saying, it can't be horror if it's good.
Liar, liar.
I am.
A bad or average Oscar bait drama is simply a bad film, but if it's a bad horror film, however, it represents the entire genre. But we horror fans know better.
Oh, brilliant.
The on-paper definition of feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes. So if we apply that to the horror genre, what does that mean? Does it mean having female protagonists who drive the story as opposed to being background characters or love interests? Does it mean female writers, directors and producers getting the opportunity to tell their own stories as opposed to men speaking for them? Or how about using horror to explore issues and fears about what it means to be female? You could argue yes to all three.
If he was mine, I would have gone already. But he isn't mine. He's yours.
Let's even take a look at two classic works of horror fiction, Frankenstein and Dracula. Frankenstein was written by a woman, Mary Shelley, and while it is focused predominantly on men, it does contain the important message that women should not be excluded from the process of creating life. Dracula has gotten a somewhat undeserved reputation as a critique on female sexuality, mostly thanks to a certain 1993 film which takes more cues from 80s slasher movies and the dreaded death by sex trope.
You can never have sex. No! Big no-no!
While there is that cultural anxiety of swarthy foreigners coming to steal our women, in terms of female representation, the story has far more going for it.
I just know what men desire.
Lucy Westenra is not the slutty best friend pop culture likes to imagine her as. There's no real commentary on the nature of good and bad victims simply because Lucy gets turned into a vampire and dies.
Why can't a woman marry two men? Or at least as many as want her. Save all this trouble.
If Lucy symbolises anything, it's the fading of the aristocracy as the world moves into the 20th century. Rather than being slut-shamed or treated as ruined because of the rape analogue, what happens to Lucy is shown as a tragedy. That this sweet, virtuous young girl gets corrupted and turned into a child-killing monster, and she's said to join other angels in heaven. Mina, meanwhile, represents the modern woman, with a job of her own and a vital role in the story. The men actually frequently fail at protecting her, while Mina is valued for her intelligence and bravery.
Take me away from all this death.
You could argue that Mina also turns Dracula's power against him. These details are usually lost in the sanitized film adaptations from the Golden Age, which turned Mina into the screaming damsel and Lucy into the whore who must be punished.
You're positively indecent.
But you had a nice little commentary on the evolution of women's positions as we entered the 20th century.
Do you think Madame Curie would invite such comparisons? Really?
Another classic, Carmilla, gave us the archetypal lesbian vampire, and actually offers up plenty of layers and depth to the title character. Carmilla is a monster, but she still cares for Laura in her own way, occasionally feels guilt for what she does, and contemplates her own existence. Sure, she dies by the end, but she's presented as a tragic monster, and Laura mourns her. There's a very good reason Carmilla is still a popular character for modern interpretations, including an incredibly successful vlog series. Moving into the film world, while the golden age of Hollywood did favour its distressed damsels, there were a few gems in terms of rounded female characters.
It's behind his back. Everybody's laughing because he's in love with you.
Freaks by Dracula director Todd Browning had some important statements on the nature of inner and outer beauty.
We accept a one of us. We accept a one of us.
Actually featuring genuine sideshow performers, including a dwarf woman, conjoined twins, and a bearded lady, and presenting them as the sympathetic protagonists, while the traditionally beautiful Hercules and Cleopatra were the evil villains.
Moja sestra.
Val Lewton's Cat People introduces fear of sexuality into the typical werewolf movie, or were-panther in this case. The protagonist is a Serbian woman who fears she'll transform into a monster if she's intimate with her husband.
I'm not afraid of you.
This adds more conflict to the story, because Irena's fear of her own sexuality is what results in her marriage falling apart and her husband falling in love with another woman. In addition to this, it comments on the nature of the woman's position in society in a similar way to Dracula.
Don't be afraid of me, Irena.
While on the surface it appears to be wholesome all-American Alice versus vampy foreign Irena, remember that Irena is a rather chaste character who won't even kiss her husband because of her fears. And while she has a job as an illustrator, it becomes clear that she has very little life or hobbies of her own outside of her marriage.
Been married for almost a month.
Alice, meanwhile, has a more independent life and career of her own, and even supports Ollie falling for Irena if that's what makes him happy.
Nonsense. Irena's a grand girl. She and Oliver are going to be very happy together.
Whereas Irena becomes possessive and jealous. Alice is far more sexually forward and arguably in touch with her own sexuality. Even so, Irena's eventual transformation and death is brought on when an evil man takes advantage of her, and the death is played tragically.
She never lied to us.
Not to mention that this is one of Simone Simon's best performances.
What is the matter, Alice?
This will be a recurring thing.
Flora. Who is it? Over there.
Fast forward to the 60s and things really start getting good.
No one can hear you if you scream in the night, isn't that so, Mrs. Dudley?
A lot of films in that decade explore the topic of mental illness through horror, using a sympathetic female protagonist either battling or recovering from trauma.
Mr. Bax, I'm completely well now.
The Witches I already talked about, and hot mess though it can be, deserves a lot of credit for deconstructing feminine hysteria, and doing so through a protagonist who's clearly over 40.
We're going to be great friends, Theo. Like sisters?
The Haunting likewise follows a late 30s woman trying to take control of her own life after years of repression.
Nell, who could look back into the past.
While also cleverly leaving it open to interpretation if there are ghosts, or she's just losing her mind.
Whose hand was I holding?
Also a rather sympathetic portrayal of a lesbian from the time period. Plus, Julie Harris gives a killer performance as Eleanor, and it's second only to her great work in East of Eden.
I saw him staring. Who, miss? The same man, the man on the tower. The tower?
Continuing this theme, we have one of my favourite films of all time in The Innocents, a masterpiece that again leaves it open whether a Victorian governess is actually seeing ghosts, or just letting her imagination and sexual repression run away with her.
Oh, I could feel pity for her. If she herself were not so pitiless.
Deborah Kerr, one of the greatest actresses to have ever lived, and with 6 Oscar nominations, considered this her favourite role.
And where, my pet, is Miss Jessel? Where is she, Flora?
Even Roger Corman's The Mask of the Red Death has a surprisingly proactive female lead in Francesca.
No, I beg of you! Mercy, mercy!
Who spends the film doing what she can to save her father and lover, who were in the traditionally female role of the captives. She's also defined by her strong Christian faith.
Or are you a true Christian believer?
Yes, I believe. Truly.
which she struggles to hold on to as she sees a Satan-worshipping prince tormenting her people.
I see you no longer turn away from the cruelties of life.
I no longer care. My life is done.
The 60s also brought us Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which dared explore the topic of what happens to a woman once her youth and beauty fade.
Say I love you.
While it did give birth to an odd subgenre of crazy old women tormenting people, known as psycho biddy, it did feature women over 50 as the protagonists, and gave the material a sophistication that many of its imitators lacked.
There's no time. You must listen.
Following tradition, Bette Davis and Joan Crawford gave it their all, and the film is among both of their best performances.
All this time we could have been friends.
And it showed that horror provided a home for actresses who Hollywood considered too old for their mainstream films.
How do you go about getting an exorcism?
Following on from that, a lot of horror films offer some pretty good roles for mothers, who in other genres are either supporting characters or sacrificial lambs.
No, of course not. Nothing like that.
How about Chris MacNeil in The Exorcist, Diane Freeling in Poltergeist, Grace Stewart in The Others, all trying to protect their children from supernatural forces.
Away from my baby!
Or Rachel Keller in The Ring, who in addition to being a single mother is also a very driven journalist trying to find out what happened to her dead niece.
Andy, get out of the house! Mrs. Copeland's getting out of the house! Please, run!
The Fog has a single working mother as the protagonist, and the horror is mined from knowing her son is in danger and being unable to do anything directly, because she has to help warn the rest of the town.
He cut us off!
Where is it?
Right behind us in the driveway.
Inside.
The film also features a grand total of 4 major female characters from various ages and walks of life, plus Janet Leigh and Jamie Lee Curtis starring in the same film.
There's a study in back. I'll show you the way. Come on. Hurry.
Both versions of Dark Water involve the ghost of an abandoned little girl, and the protagonist is the only one who can reach her because of her motherhood. And the climax emphasises the power of a mother's love.
First there's a fire.
The Last House on the Left allows the mother to enjoy the typically male role of getting revenge on her daughter's tormentors. More recent films such as Hereditary and The Babadook incorporate the struggles of being a mother into the horror itself. The underrated Halloween H2O gives Laurie Strode a much stronger arc than the 2018 film, showing her ultimately confronting her trauma because she has to save her son and his friends, while also allowing a mother to be flawed and have conflict. And let's segue to Laurie Strode, one of the codifiers of the iffy final girl trope.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.
The original Halloween gives us 3 female leads: rebellious Annie, ditzy Linda, and shy, responsible Laurie.
You know, Annie, someday you're gonna get us all into deep trouble.
It's often been interpreted as a cautionary tale on the bad behaviour of teenagers. Although I'd argue Annie is punished more for being trusted to babysit this child and instead dumping her on her doormat of a friend to run off to fool around with her boyfriend, while also letting her other friends fool around in the house she's supposed to be watching.
This is going nowhere.
The film is sometimes accused of being misogynistic, but it's often forgotten that it was co-written by a woman, producer Deborah Hill, who wrote most of the female dialogue to make it more natural.
I'll be totally wiped out.
I don't think you have enough to do tomorrow.
Totally.
Having a female creator doesn't prevent a work from having misogynistic or sexist undertones, but it is still an example of women being allowed to tell their own stories.
Not bad. Not bad at all. A work of art.
And that's exactly what feminism is about. Let's also remind ourselves that the final girl survives usually because she's the one to fight off the killer.
Do as I say! Hurry!
Laurie in particular gets traumatized by seeing the bodies of her friends paraded in front of her, but she fights off Michael 3 times, doing whatever she can to protect the children.
I got you.
Alien came out the year after, and although Ellen Ripley didn't really become a feminist icon until the sequel, oh hey, another kick-ass mother, it shouldn't be forgotten that it started in the first film.
Ash, Wendalis and Kane are off the ship. I'm senior officer.
Ridley Scott wasn't aiming to make a greater statement about gender, since Ripley was intended to be a male and Sigourney Weaver simply gave the best audition, but horror films were allowing women to defeat the villains and save themselves long before the action girl became a mainstream thing.
Die! Die!
Suspiria is a proto-slasher and has zero emphasis on sex, with the final girl being the only one who shows interest in a boy, and even that is just a casual flirtation.
She's even that way with me. She really is an invaluable teacher.
Suspiria is especially worth mentioning when you bring in discussions about female representation.
This is the first time we've worked together. I want to see what you can do, how far along you are.
The story is entirely female-driven, with males only in supporting roles. It revolves around a female-dominated pursuit, in this case ballet. If you want to get nitpicky, it also passes the Bechdel test, and its more effective cousin, the Marco Mori test, since both Susie and Sarah's arcs are all about finding out what their teachers are up to, as opposed to being about their relationships with men.
Look! What's the matter with you?
This shouldn't seem notable, but remember how in the 2000s, the prevailing attitude was that female-led films didn't sell.
Male academia.
Wonder Woman's movie was in development since the 90s and didn't get released until 2017, while the MCU didn't get a female-led film until 2019. Horror has consistently been one of the few genres that has allowed for female-led casts and explore female themes for years.
Until half an hour ago, Carrie White thought her first period was homeroom.
Carrie is an interesting one, and I won't dwell on it too much since I just did a whole series on it, but the creation of it is worth mentioning.
I threw it away and my wife fished it out and said, "This is sort of amusing, you ought to go on with this," and so I did.
Is that exactly what she said?
No, it isn't exactly what she said. She said it was really good, and she wanted to read... She said she wanted to read the rest of it.
Precisely because of the horror potential of a traumatic first period.
They want to see us punished.
Punished for what? For being young?
Plenty of teen horror films have actually explored issues that young people face, such as Ginger Snaps likewise using menstruation to tie into a werewolf story.
Granny says wolves might not always be what they seem.
The Company of Wolves does similar with the Red Riding Hood fairy tale, merging it with an exploration of werewolf mythology and a teenage girl's budding sexuality.
How do you enter? With perfect love and perfect trust.
The Craft talks about mental illness, slut-shaming, girl-on-girl bullying, and how social outcasts might be drawn to destructive habits.
Do you guys worship the devil?
All while having a cast full of unconventional teenage girls.
Very many young ethnic girls of all backgrounds have come up to me and said it was just amazing that someone who kind of sort of looked like me was in that group and in that movie.
Once again, an actress's best work is in a horror.
What's going on? Aren't you dead? You came to me. Saved me.
In this case, Robin Tunney, Rachel True, and Fairuza Balk. Neve Campbell, well, her time would come. Scream acknowledges the undertones of misogyny in some of the famous slashers and incorporates them into the story.
Maybe your mom was just a very unhappy woman.
While also giving us a great female lead in Sidney Prescott, and some other memorable female supporting characters such as Gail Weathers and Tatum Riley.
Nice welt, sweetie.
Once again, Neve Campbell's most iconic performance.
Did you know the victim? Do you think there'll be more murder?
The sequels even examine what it would be like to live with that victimhood after the credits roll.
Eric is 18. Lisa was 16. That's statutory rape.
Other teen horror films of the 90s touched on interesting issues.
Lisa was acting all happy, like we were going steady. And I had to break the news to her that she was just a pump.
The Rage, Carrie 2 examines sexual politics with a series of jocks who get away with statutory rape, and the effects it has on the psyche of their victims.
Okay, now I want my life back.
I Know What You Did Last Summer, which I continue to think is quite underrated, has some interesting things to say about the transition between childhood and adulthood.
What happened between us? We used to be best friends. We used to be a lot of things.
While also giving us a pretty unexpectedly awesome character in Helen.
I don't think we're that powerful, Julie. You're giving us way too much credit.
Julie, well, she tries.
Let's make the right one this time.
I'm not interested in what's right anymore, Ray. I want to do what's smart.
The 2000s weren't the best time for horror, but Jennifer's Body is being re-evaluated for its statements about rape culture and female friendships.
She's actually evil, not high school evil.
And it deserves way more credit than it's given.
Or you had a test group and somebody was like, it needs more boobs.
I still have the card.
Again, Megan Fox, who is being showcased for her TNA and nothing else, gives a career-defining performance.
Yes, I'm a virgin. I've never even done sex. I don't know how.
The 2017 adaptation of It tackles the still very taboo topic about a 12-year-old girl's developing sexuality.
Tell me you're still my little girl.
And how girls can be sexualized and fetishized as they grow older. The Witch touches on this as well.
JD, we got a survivor!
When we move into the subgenre of survival horror, it's arguably here that the film's first action heroine started to emerge.
What's happening?
Oh, you think it's happening?
What's happening?
Yes, the original Night of the Living Dead has Barbara going catatonic for most of the film.
Oh, I'd like to leave. Yes.
But this was just the idea of her actress Judith O'Dea.
In order to understand it, Barbara went inside.
She really shut down.
She shut down in order to figure it all out. Then she came right to the surface again, grabbed that board, and went for the door. You know, I consider Barbara a strong character. She just needed to take what time she needed in order to get there.
And the original plan was for her to be more in line with how she is in the 1990 remake.
Whatever I lost a long time ago, and I do not plan on losing anything else. You can talk to me about losing it when you stop screaming at each other like a bunch of 2-year-olds.
Even so, the remake's Barbara was fighting in the front lines 7 years before Buffy Summers.
And how do you know they're not all fucked up like everybody else out there?
Well, for one thing, they're driving a truck. Oh, and shooting guns.
Another heroine no one talks about enough is Anna from the Dawn of the Dead remake.
They killed Tucker, too.
Wait a minute. I was never bit.
We can't be sure. Do it, Michael.
Who is also the rare thing known as a kick-ass nurse. Once again, Sarah Polley kills the role.
I'm sorry, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about killing him?
Some people will get annoyed at me calling 28 Days Later a zombie film, but Selena is a great character.
Do you want us to find a cure and save the world, or just fall in love and fuck?
Someone who begins the film bitter and cynical with a kill or be killed attitude.
Staying alive's as good as it gets.
But ultimately not being able to stop herself from caring and feeling, and being empowered by her love and compassion for the other survivors.
I was wrong when I said that staying alive is as good as it gets.
Once again, stellar work by Naomi Harris, and this is the rare time when a woman of colour gets to be the female lead.
We have no choice but to keep moving, because those things are right behind us. You got that?
The Resident Evil movie series is usually a laughingstock, but I feel that the first is a genuinely fun movie, and Alice is an example of a character with amnesia made actually interesting, since she spends half the film worrying that she may have been the cause of this outbreak.
It's okay, we're here to help.
And Rain will always be one of Michelle Rodriguez's most iconic roles.
How is she still standing?
Bitch isn't standing now.
I really don't think you should provoke somebody like that, Barb.
Oh, listen, this guy's minor league in the city. I get 2 of those a day.
Maybe.
Finally, we return to the original Black Christmas, a 1974 classic considered the grandfather of the slasher genre.
Could that be one person?
No, Claire, that's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir doing their annual obscene phone call.
A simple plot about sorority girls being harassed by an unseen stalker who slowly murders them one by one.
Agnes, it's me, Billy.
Brought to life by Bob Clark's solid direction and a cast of refreshingly unconventional female leads. We have Barb, the hilarious party girl.
Fellatio. It's a new exchange. F-E.
Phyllis, the quirky yet caring empath.
I'd rather face the killer.
Mrs. Mack, the outrageous housemother.
Damn it, Claude, you little prick!
This is very kind of you, Mr. Harrison.
And Jess, the final girl, who is allowed to have a sexual relationship with her boyfriend and plans to get an abortion without being demonized.
You are not going to abort that baby.
Peter, you're not going to tell me what I can and cannot do.
Even Claire, the first victim, is given just enough characterization to make you feel for her.
Where have you been? Mrs. Mack's been looking all over for you. Oh, little puss. Hello.
It's a horror film with characters, not just lambs for the slaughter.
You don't believe me, do you? Well, I mean, how could I make something like that up?
Feminist horror does not just have to be about fuck the patriarchy narratives. Sometimes it can be just about women simply being there and having their stories told with just as much finesse as a man's would be.